Yeah, before we start with today's lecture, uh, I have two brief announcements, and uh, then I'll hand over to my colleague, Professor Goody, whom I have requested to give this lecture on applications of SVD to industrial problems or real life problems uh, through principal component analysis, correspondence analysis, and so on. So yesterday, when I stopped my lecture, I forgot to put this slide because many of you asked what are the references. So the first book, of course, we have given to you in the kit, and it's one of the best books according to me for teaching. Uh, Second book, Leonberger. This is one of the classic books in control theory. So this book is out of print, but you might find uh, somewhere repository you might find copies of this book. Khalil is the probably one of the best books available for nonlinear systems analysis. And those of you who are interested in taking knowing further formally through mathematical rigor, you should refer to Khalil. We use it for teaching. So what I presented to you yesterday is just tip of the iceberg. If you want to know deeper, I would recommend Khalil's book, very nicely done for continuous time differential equations. If you want difference equations, nonlinear difference equations, there are other books. Ogata is a standard textbook for control systems engineering, and you will find lots of examples for dynamic system modeling cutting across many domains. Uh, so with control, without control, because when we start doing control, first thing we do is modeling of systems. And adaptive control is the book where I have taken the flight control example. There are many things in the appendix. How do you do computations of matrix exponentials, and also the formal definition, uh, epsilon delta definition of stability. And actually, what I taught you yesterday was what is called as the first method of Lyapunov. Lyapunov was a Russian mathematician who is probably one of the uh, big name in stability of uh, ordinary differential equations, like a founding father. And he uh, control systems we use entire work developed by Lyapunov way back in I think 1860 or 1870, his PhD thesis. So you need to understand stability theory to deal with differential equations. So there are some appendix is given here. That is one thing. The other thing that I just wanted to announce was, um, yeah, it's not visible. Okay, so this is uh, Professor Harish Pillai and myself. We have developed some notes on how you could make teaching of Gaussian elimination and QR decomposition interesting from the viewpoint of condition number. So you start introducing, you introduce condition number first, and then we give a lot of examples to create a some doubt in minds of students that everything that computer gives is not correct. There could be errors, and these notes I have uploaded on the Moodle site for our course, so you can download and have a look. So this is, yeah. So with these two things, let me now shift to the main lecture. Gives me pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Ravindra Goody. He's professor and head of chemical engineering, and currently he holds institute chair for AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. So he's going to talk about applications of SVD to industrial problems, real life problems.
Okay, thanks Sachin for the kind introduction and the opportunity to be able to share some of my research that we've been doing with students, with all of you. Uh, I mean, Sachin and I go a long time back, but one of the common threads that we hold is that we work in systems engineering, and in systems engineering, which is essentially looking at manufacturing systems, chemical process systems, robotics, all of that. When you look at it from an end-to-end systemic viewpoint, we are able to address some of the key issues related to understanding, the dynamics of the system, the performance of the system, improving the safety of the system, improving the performance and the like. And so, when you are doing systems engineering, it stands broadly on two pillars. If you know your linear algebra well and you know your statistics well, you will be able to pick up and understand various other advances that happen in systems engineering. And given that linear algebra and statistics are one of the key pillars, the most elegant tool in linear algebra is singular value decomposition. So, you need to know singular value decomposition in all its glory. I mean, the one presented in such a short course, you can't really show its full glory. You can just expose one to what glories are there with SVD. But in this lecture, what I will try and do is build upon some of the I happened to see Professor Verma's notes on the Moodle. Also Gilbert Strang, of course, the linear algebra book by Gilbert Strang, and several other expositions have happened as part of this workshop on linear algebra and SVD. What I will try and do is I will try and give you a kind of a flavor of how SVD can be applied to some industrial problems, and I will start with some of the basic aspects of SVD, how it is a result of also an optimization problem, because that is how one would address an engineering situation. Formulation, when you when you look at formulating an engineering problem, you typically formulate it as an optimization problem. It turns out that SVD has an optimization connotation as well. And then what we will do is we will look at the broad classes of applications where SVD has a very significant role to play. One of the titles that I have used here is correspondence analysis. However, what I am going to talk about is not restricted to that. I am going to motivate this whole analysis, the correspondence analysis, from an SVD point of view. So, I will just probably tell you something about, in terms of motivation, that we are looking at a system which essentially has deterministic causes, the causes that one applies on the system, the effects that typically one measures from the system, and of course, while these are known, for example, the deterministic cause is known to a reasonable extent because one is applying that on the system. The effect is measured, it is contaminated with measurement noise, it is approximately known, but there is a big class of inputs also to a system that are typically disturbances that belong to an unknown class of inputs, right. So, disturbances and inputs, for a case in point is when you are flying in an airplane, the attitude, everything is determined by the control system, but when you go through a cloud, that is a disturbance, or when you go through a clean, what they call as a clear air turbulence, suddenly you have a dip and so on. So, those are unforeseen, unknown disturbances that typically affect the system, they show up in these. Now, the typical relationship between a cause and effect could be fairly complex, non-linear, dynamic, it could be time varying. Okay. If you go very close by to our Bhabha Atomic Research Center that makes runs nuclear reactors to generate power, you need to be extremely careful about abnormal situations, aberrant situations. So, you could have abnormal situations, you could have parameter shifts, and so typically trying to bring all of this together, let us assume for the purposes of our discussion today that this data essentially all can be accumulated into a matrix, a two-dimensional matrix, dimension m cross n, which means m samples in n variables. You have n variables that essentially are important when you operate a system, and the system is essentially throwing out to the sensors a lot of data. Let us assume that there are m, the size of that is m in n variables. Okay. Now, you want to essentially be able to delve into this data and try to make sense. What is it that it is trying to tell you, right? This whole area of data analytics, AI, ML, etc., etc. What we are really talking about is you have strings of data that can be accumulated together to constitute what we would call as an information, So data to information like trends, increasing, decreasing and the like. Information, you can distill together information from several different variables put together, it essentially constitutes knowledge. So for example, is an aberrant operation because of something that somebody did upstream or downstream of a manufacturing plant. Okay. Now that's essentially trying to analyze the correlation between them. So now you have data, data to information, information to knowledge. And then when you have knowledge from several such manufacturing facilities, eventually you try to collate all of that together, distill all of that together into what's called wisdom. So there is typically a knowledge pyramid, if you will. It starts from data, data to information, information to knowledge, knowledge to wisdom. Okay. Now if you want to do all of that, you need to be able to look at this matrix X and try to see what it's trying to tell you. Like one of our key researchers working in this area, Professor Sirish Shah, says, listen carefully to your data. It has a very interesting story to reveal, right? You just need to look at this data and see whether what you want to do is, and here what I'm trying to focus on is probably just one of them, not both. I'm trying to look at the aspect of fault detection and diagnosis, although I will allude to some of the aspects of this area called nonlinear identification. Okay, so I'll essentially what all of this is motivated towards is when you are looking at data, there are classes in the data. Okay. There could be a single class, there could be multiple classes, normal operation, abnormal operation, so on, right? There could be classes in the data. Can you somehow look at this data and try to see what these classes are? And so there is this whole area in terms of a background, pattern classification methods, that essentially is a subfield of decision theory way back in the late 60s, early 70s, followed by Bayes decision theory, and then their variants like the maximum likelihood, the Bayes parameter estimation, and then of course coming closer to the area that I work in, process plants, Himmelblau, Kramer. There are some non-parametric methods for classification, Parsons window, nearest neighbor, discriminant analysis versus linear and nonlinear discriminant functions, non-metric methods based on logical rules. So these are essentially classification and regression trees, okay, and a whole bunch of other advanced learning, supervised and unsupervised learning algorithms, clustering algorithms such as principal components, nonlinear correspondence analysis, independent correspondence analysis and the like. So this is essentially an evolution of the literature. If you want to really try to delve into a data matrix to see what it's trying to tell you and you want to analyze it, a quick overview of what all of this is all about in terms of trying to reveal the underlying information. Okay. Skip this because it's getting too domain specific. So now I said that the data matrix can contain several classes or a single class. It would contain patterns. So you want to essentially try and process, analyze the data to be able to say what are the classes, what are the important classes in there, right? So let's look at what's the desirable features if we have such an algorithm, if we have such a suite of algorithms. Let us see what are the desirable features of those. Okay, so it must have, for example, a strong discriminatory ability. A case in point is if I am looking at aberrant operation, unstable operation of a nuclear reactor versus a normal operation, I must be able to look at the data and say when is the operation going from a normal to an abnormal, right? So essentially I need to have two distinct classes. I need to be able to look at the data and say here are the two distinct classes. So the algorithm or the suite of algorithms should essentially have a strong discriminatory ability that looks for spaces which have sharper resolution between the groups and classes. And this is ideal. This is an ideal situation where you want the classes to be as resolved. Process the data in a new dimension space, subspace if you will, so that that data when it gets transformed, it essentially reveals itself as two distinct classes. Ideally, they should be as distinct as possible. Sometimes it may not, in which case you should be able to accommodate, if there is an overlap between the classes, you should be able to accommodate the overlap between the classes. Typically, when you are looking at the data, you do have some information, prior knowledge, you would like to incorporate them, but preferably these set of algorithms must be completely independent, agnostic to the application. They should be able to work with minimal a priori knowledge, number of clusters, groups, not in terms of how many classes are there. Sometimes this may be known, sometimes this may not be known, should be able to work with that. it should essentially, now this is where we are trying to get into SVD now, it should accommodate different correlation structures in the data. Okay, what I mean by that is typically when we look at a facility or we are trying to look at data generation, we don't know where we should locate sensors. Okay, you would prefer to err on the safer side and have more sensors than are actually necessary. Usually that's the case, in which case you have an inflated measurement space. The space that you are trying to, the dimension of the X matrix is more inflated than what it should be strictly. Okay, so you are putting more sensors and giving you more information, right? But essentially all of the sensors are trying to tell you something about just one underlying phenomenon. Okay, so the question is, can these algorithms reveal a lower dimension subspace, which is where the process is operating, where the manufacturing facility is operating, that characterizes what? Association between variables. How are two variables associated? You want to be able to understand that. The algorithm must be able to reveal that. It must also be able to tell you association between samples. Can a sample measured at this point in time have or be influenced by the state of the system at some instance in the past? Typically, the case is when we have a delay. When I apply an input on a system, I get its response after a delay. So now what I am saying is that the data associated with my input and the data associated with my output, there is a relationship between them through the delay. So can it help me understand the association between the samples in different points in time? But the more critical problem in systems analysis is that I would certainly like to do this, but I want to do this, the joint association between variables and samples. Okay, and I will show you a case, number of applications where this is important. Okay, and in a number of cases, especially in engineering systems, you have dynamics that is inherently present in the system. Professor Sachin talked about the stability of dynamic systems and the like. You essentially do have, and you have to live with dynamics. When you apply an input, as I said, the output is going to respond only after a certain amount of time. Dynamics are inherent in any cause and effect relationships. You should be able to handle this dynamic dependencies. So there are a number of methods that do this, but then what I am trying to motivate to you is that the algorithm must work with retaining the matrix structure and not expanding the column space. Might not be so obvious to you now about what I am saying, but eventually I will explain what I mean by that. Okay. Now here is some quick graphical illustration of what I am going to say in future. Okay, the next few slides. So given a matrix X that belongs to R m cross n, we can look at two kinds of clouds. Okay, one is what we call as the row cloud. The rows of the matrix, the samples, okay, they belong to space R to the n. Okay, and if I project all the points there, I get what is called as a row cloud. So any point Ri is a point in the n dimension space, and this is a row cloud. Okay. If I do the same thing with the columns, okay, I get what's called as a column cloud, and that is R to the m space. Okay. So let's be clear. X is R m cross n. I'm taking each of those columns and I project them in an appropriate m space. I get a column cloud. I take each of these samples, project it onto an appropriate dimension space, I get a row cloud. So this is a row cloud and a column cloud. Okay, the visual representation of the X matrix. Okay. Now what I am going to show you is a graphical illustration of what SVD is. Okay. What SVD does is it essentially says that you can view your data in what's called as a biplot. Okay, it's a graphical way of viewing matrices, a joint display of row and column points of the factors of a matrix. Now there are several factors of the matrix X. One of the most elegant ones is a singular value decomposition. Okay, so now can we see what these factors, how are they shown? For example, if I do a singular value decomposition of a matrix X, I will get Xij, the element in ijth element in X, can be written as k going from 1 to R, Gik lambda k h kj. Okay. This is how I can represent an element Xij in a matrix X. Okay. this is what SVD tells you. Eventually, while you know it as USV transpose, right, you can always write it in this form, summation I equal to 1 to R GIK lambda K HKJ. Okay. If you look at this, the singular value which you see here as lambda K, singular value decomposition represents it as such as lambda, the diagonal matrix. Okay. What you can do is you can actually write it as alpha plus beta. This lambda K can be written, it's to the power of 1. You can write it as lambda K to the power of alpha plus beta, and say alpha plus beta is equal to 1 over here, which is what you see. Okay. And now what you can do is you can partition the singular value, right? You can partition the singular value, bring the lambda to the power of alpha into the left and the lambda to the power of beta into the right. Okay. And if you are able to do this, then this is a further step to singular value decomposition, and as I will show you, this brings in a lot more power to the singular value decomposition algorithm in terms of being able to interpret what it is trying to tell you. Okay. So, how do we represent all of this information? I will just show you a simple example. I take this 4 cross 3 matrix, just any arbitrary matrix X. Okay. I subject this to a decomposition. So, when I subject this to a decomposition, I get a matrix here and I get a matrix of this kind. So, you can verify that if these two matrices are multiplied, I get the original matrix. Okay. Now, this is 2 columns and 2 rows, sorry, this C1, C2, C3 must be outside of the matrix. So, 2 columns, 2 rows, it is a biplot, which is a plot in 2 dimensions of the factors. I can actually represent that figuratively. A graphical way of representing the factorization as I take each of these rows, okay, you will see that these are the row points, okay, the row markers. I will take each of these columns, those are the column points, and this is a graphical way of showing the same singular value decomposition, but restricted to 2 factors, okay, the first 2, right. So, if I decide to do, if I do a 3 dimension, I go to 3 dimension, I can essentially do it into a triplot. Okay. So, this is one way to represent the factors of this matrix X into an appropriate viewing space that helps me, and how it helps me I will just show you in a short while. Okay. Turns out that, you know, if I just rewind a little bit and say what are the desirable features. So, recall the desirable features was association between variables, association between samples, and a joint association between rows and samples. You know, when I look at the matrix here and say that the row column and the column and the row marker and the column marker, you see, if each of these blue squares cluster together, then I can say that those rows or samples are in some way similar. When each of these red asterisks cluster together, I am able to say that those are correlated, because these are clusters are essentially columns. You can say that those variables are correlated. Okay, they behave either similarly, the rows samples behave similarly, or so now I have a way to characterize the rows, which is that if these come together in a single cluster or close by, those rows or samples behave similar manner. Okay. If these come together, I say that they are correlated. Okay. If the angle between a row marker and a column marker is acute, there is a correlation between that row and that column. Okay. If it is completely at 180 degrees, there is a negative relationship. If it is orthogonal, there is no relationship. We can derive those kind of interpretations when you start viewing your factors in this space. Okay. And that is what I am going to show you as an application, building upon the regular SVD, where alpha plus beta, alpha is equal to 1, beta is equal to 0, which is what is called principal components analysis. And then we start looking at varying that alpha and beta, partitioning the singular value across the 2 left and right factors, and then trying to see some more interesting interpretations based on this biplot. Okay. Alright, so now let us come to the first method, singular value decomposition, but as applied to principal components analysis. So now let us look at the principal components analysis. What does principal components analysis tell you? Principal components analysis first assumes that the rows, the samples, okay, are statistically independent. Okay. It factors an appropriately scaled data matrix to reveal some hidden relationships in the column space. Now my intent is very clear here. I want to try to detect relationships between columns. If I move this mouse, if I apply a force on this mouse moves. So there is a correlation between the position of the mouse and my effort. I want to detect this correlation. Okay, many times in complex systems these relationships are unknown. Why does something result into a fault? The source is unknown. I want to be able to detect that source. Okay, so now I want to see, can I look at revealing the hidden relationships in the column space. What I do first is I say that let me pose this as an optimization problem where I take one linear combination. So maybe I need to use the board here. I take one linear combination, let us call that as T1, okay, T1 as one linear combination of the matrix X times P1. Okay. So I take that linear combination, and what I say is that this linear combination, there could be several linear combinations depending on what P1 is. Okay. I want to find out that P1, okay, that explains the variance that I see in X to the best possible extent. Okay. And so I formulate this as an optimization problem where I say that variance is T1 transpose T1, correct. This is the variance. This variance I want to maximize. Pose it as an optimization problem. I want to maximize that variance. How do I maximize that variance? I choose my P1. So I essentially say that in the space of P1, I want to maximize T1 transpose T1, and if I open up this space, it becomes P1 transpose X P1. Okay. Now even here, there could be several solutions to that problem, so I need to put an additional constraint. Okay. That additional constraint is P1 transpose P1 is equal to 1. I put that as an additional constraint and solve this optimization problem. Okay. So it turns out that I can analytically solve this problem. If I include this constraint, it can be shown that it results into a singular value decomposition problem that canonically decomposes the variance. So if I have a variance in X, as I look at P1, as I look at P2, as I look at P3, P4, P5, several linear combinations, it turns out that singular value decomposition essentially gives you, if I do an SVD of X, it gives me that matrix P, and as we know that matrix P is also normal. So P transpose P is equal to I. Okay. It canonically decomposes the variance in X. What does canonical decomposition mean? That the first linear combination explains the best possible variance. There is no other linear combination that can do better. The second linear combination T2 cannot do better than T1, but it is the next in the residual space. T3 is in the further residual space, T4 and so on. So I keep decomposing canonically in terms of decreasing amounts of variance that each principal component explains, okay, each linear combination explains, right. So that is what principal components analysis does. Starting from an optimization problem, it turns out that it can be solved using SVD, yeah. So it can be posed as an eigenvalue eigenvector decomposition, which when you build further, you can show that you can write it as X is equal to TP transpose plus an error matrix. You can relate it to the singular value decomposition, which is U times S times V transpose, and TP transpose is the best n approximation. So we have m rows and n columns. This is the best n approximation of X, and the E matrix contains redundancies and noise. Okay. So this is one very powerful application of singular value decomposition, where you just take the X matrix, factor it out U into S into V transpose, accumulate this U and S together into a matrix T, which is the matrix of, if you will, new variables. This is the original variables, this is a linear combination which is the new variables, the matrix of new variables. How are they related to the original variables? The matrix P will give you that relationship, the coefficients, the weights on the new variables to construct, on the original variables to construct the new variables, right. So, that is one powerful way to interpret SVD and say that now what I am trying to do is trying to look at the data, trying to look at what are the directions of variance and can I approximate them into a new space which can help me to interpret that data better. Okay. So, there is what we have written here, x is equal to Tp transpose can be written as T1 P1 transpose plus T2 P2 transpose up to Tn Pn transpose plus E, and each of these outer products is a rank 1 matrix, and so you essentially can do a factorization of that kind, right. We are essentially doing this factorization of the matrix X, and now once you have done this factorization, the same method of viewing the factorization into the biplot or appropriate triplot. I mean, you can't visualize beyond 3, but if you turns out that you have n dimensions, you can actually look at visualization tools that will look at 2 or 3 directions at a time and be able to help you interpret the data. Okay. So, I will skip all of this in the interest of time, but come back. But essentially what I am trying to say here is, if the x columns of x are correlated, remember I said if I apply a force on this, this moves. So, the force and the displacement is correlated, but my x matrix will contain data on my force, it will also contain data on my correlations. Can I say that these two are correlated? Singular value decomposition will help you to do that, and we will see some examples of that. Okay. I will skip this in the interest of time, scores plot and loadings plot. I will just come back to the principal components, but before that let me see if I can show you a very quick example. Okay, so that I just want to show you the simple 3-dimension space. Okay. Now, I have all of these green samples that I get in the 3-dimension space. How many dominant directions are there when you look at it visually? So, so let us look at this. So, if I now do a SVD of it, it reveals to me one, I think because of the color it is not visible, but you see one dominant direction in this, okay, that explains how much variance of the that is present in the original X space, 93%, and this is what you would expect, right. When you look at this, that is what you would expect. Okay. There is a second one that is orthogonal to this, which explains almost 99, almost 100%. Okay. And there is a third which is coming out of this orthogonal to both of them, okay, because remember T1 transpose T1 or Ti transpose Ti is equal to 1, but Ti transpose Tj is equal to 0. So, they are orthogonal directions. So, the second is orthogonal to the first, third will be orthogonal to both. That will explain the residual, which is the 0.15%. Okay. So, it helps you to essentially construct a different space which will reveal the lower dimension space and then serve the aspect of dimensionality reduction. Okay. So, now I project this into a 2-dimensional space. The earlier data was in 3-dimension space, right. I am now able to view the same data in 2-dimension space, and I am able to understand all the correlation. Okay. There are examples in industry where we have looked at data where there are more than 500 variables and we are able to compress them into 90 or so. So, in terms of data compression and visualization, certainly is a much convenient way to look at the data. Okay. Okay. So, I hope I was able to tell you about one aspect of SVD as applied to data matrix X to essentially try to identify the relationship between variables, relationship between samples, right. Now, what you saw in the example was that there is a correlation between x1 and x2, the variables which was identified in the lower dimension space. Okay. Many times when you look at the data matrix, the assumption on statistical independence of the samples could be violated. And so, what is typically done in engineering systems is that you go for a dynamic version of this, which is called dynamic principal components analysis, where you essentially create, so if I have x is m cross n and I know that some of the variables are dynamically correlated, which means let us say some variable x j in this is in a dynamic relationship with some other variable x k, what I would do, so let me write that relationship. I'll say xj at any instant in time t is some function of xk at some function in time t minus, let's say, t1. So I have this kind of a dynamic relationship, which means the value of the variable at t minus t1 xk at t minus t1 impacts the current value of xj. So this is a dynamic relationship. What I would just do is I would expand on the column space of x. I would essentially put in additional columns that are lagged values of my measurements and expand on the column space, which I won't delve into given the time that we have. So what happens then is that you have a much broader matrix, and that has aspects associated with statistical significance. So let's not worry about that. However, there is an approach that is dynamic PCA, which expands on the column space. Now, the PCA algorithm by itself does have some discriminative ability, but if you look at the objective function of PCA, you are trying to explain variance. You are not trying to explain you are not trying to promote discrimination. You are just trying to say, I want to find out those directions that explain the variation, not that discriminate between samples or variables. Okay. So in that case, what happens is I need to modify the objective. So objective function is maximizing variance explained. The directions do not necessarily discriminate, although there are, to some extent there is a discrimination. It detects dependencies in the column, which is what we saw. X1 and X2 are correlated. We just saw that in that example, but not either in the column, or if you do an X transpose, it will detect it in the row space, but not in the joint row and column space. This is something that we said as one of the desirable features of a pattern classifier way earlier, right? So now what we need to do is we need to look at the next approach where SVD can help. How does SVD help? SVD helps if you can help SVD. How do you help SVD? You now start labeling the class samples and give some class information. Okay. We are violating one of our desirable features of the pattern classifier. It should work with no prior information. But if we do have prior information and we can label the samples as belonging to a class, then I can use what's called as discriminant analysis to be able to exploit this information and build directions that discriminate between these classes. Okay. That's what I'm going to show you here. Given that there are C classes in the data, so X matrix contains C classes, this is prior information. If this is available, I want to be able to exploit that. Okay. FDA then determines directions such that the scatter between different classes of the data is maximized and the scatter within each data is minimized. So think about it in this manner. Suppose I have a cluster which has an overlap, okay, in the original X dimension space. What I want to be able to do is transform this data into a new dimension space where the between class scatter, see what this is, scatter between different classes is maximized and the scatter within the class is minimized. So I shrink the class and I separate them. What does that help me to do? Resolve the classes, right? If I am able to do that, if I am able to separate the classes and shrink them, it essentially gives me a much better resolution. So what I do is I then go ahead and write something called as a total scatter matrix, which is essentially when I have C classes in the data. But when I have C classes in the data, I can write a total scatter, I can write a within class scatter, because I know I have labeled the samples to belonging to class J. I can look at writing the within class scatter. I can look at the total of the within class scatter matrix and the between class scatter matrix, and if I look at all of this, I can essentially formulate a similar optimization problem, which essentially says now that I want to find out orthogonal directions as before. In PCA also I want to find out orthogonal. Why orthogonal, by the way? If I can just pause and ask you, why am I interested in orthogonal directions? It will give you maximum separation, but what you want to be able to do is, you don't want a new direction, or you don't want the information to be explained twice. So they have to be orthogonal. Why? Because the first direction explains the variance in a particular orientation. The second will be orthogonal to it. So the first one is no more explained. It's already captured by the first linear combination, right? So you want the second to explain new information, and thereby you will need smaller number of directions to explain the overall variation, right? So you want them to be orthogonal, find orthogonal directions such that between class scatter is maximized, within class scatter is minimized, and you pose it as an optimization problem here in the space of the vector mu. Okay. When I do that, it again turns out to be, if I solve this in the space of mu, I can show that it has a similar structure as the principal components analysis, an eigenvalue eigenvector decomposition, and I can solve this to generate the directions mu. Okay. Now contrast this with PCA, where the objective function can be written as this. So now if you see here, if I look at the objective function here, I have SB and SW. If I look at the objective function of PCA for the same class, I didn't show you the derivation, but I can show that it is represented in this manner, and the only thing that differentiates between these two optimization formulations is SW. And so what you are able to achieve by providing additional information is you are able to move the directions nu or orient these directions nu so that they are more discriminatory in nature rather than just explanatory in nature. Okay. PCA will give you directions that represent, explain the variance, whereas Fisher's discriminant analysis will additionally go one step ahead and say, let me discriminate between those directions. Okay. So that's what FDA does, and then there I'll just show you a few examples of the relative benefits of each of those. And now I'll just talk to you about correspondence analysis, motivate that, and then that completes the theory part, and then I'll show you a lot of applications. Okay. So now what is our objective? Our objective is to promote self-aggregation. Why do we want to promote self-aggregation? Because that helps you to resolve between the classes. Okay. Now turns out that the principal components analysis itself, and there is a formal mathematical proof for this, principal components analysis itself, although as written is not discriminatory in nature, it itself the scaling can be done in a very interesting way in PCA to be able to reveal some of the discrimination. For example, if you want to promote self-aggregation, what is self-aggregation? I said cluster of points, they combine and become tighter, that is self-aggregation, right? So starting from the same similarity matrix that PCA uses, which is the covariance, X transpose X, if you would have been exposed to earlier, okay. The scaled PCA begins with a nonlinear scaling of this covariance matrix with a factor D. What is this factor D? D is a diagonal matrix, and each diagonal element is the sum of the corresponding row of S. So I start with this covariance matrix X transpose X, just as before in PCA as well. I start with X transpose X and I do eigenvalue eigenvector decomposition. I start with X transpose X, that gives me my S. I look at the sum along all of the rows. Okay. Correct. So I am essentially summing up along each of the rows. That sum I put across in a diagonal matrix D. Okay. And then what I do is I represent this S as d to the half, d to the minus half, S, d to the minus half, d to the half. So all that I am doing here is I am just scaling S by a pre-term which is identity matrix, post which is an identity matrix, but what I am actually doing is I am taking this element within this multiplication within the column, this inner term. So if I do this, then it turns out that I can generate principal components which are called as scaled principal components. Okay. Again, it might sound very prescriptive and black magic, but it's not. There is a formal proof for this. If I take the covariance matrix, sum it up along the rows, put it in a diagonal matrix, do a d to the minus half S d to the half, minus half, if you see this here, d to the minus half S d to the minus half, and carry out a principal components analysis of this inner term, I essentially can mathematically show, theoretically show that gives you two important properties, that when no overlap exists between the clusters, the objects within the clusters will collapse into a single point, will exactly coincide. If in the original space there are no overlaps, in the transformed space they will coincide and become a single point. Okay. When overlaps exist between clusters, the objects become much more closer in the scaled space than in the original space. So, I am promoting some amount of self aggregation. Okay. I will just show you an example here. What you see here is data, some scale data related to different types of cancers. So, you will see that there are inverted triangles, there are, you see these squares, you see this pink asterisks, okay, and you see these straight upright triangles as well. This is the original data, and when I take this data and do a scaled principal component on this, it turns out that if you see all of these, and unfortunately in the resolution you can't see it here, but all of these inverted triangles essentially collapse here. You see that this is an isolated cluster, okay, this coincides to a single point, okay. So, there is a lot of self aggregation that happens without requiring prior information. See, in discriminant analysis, as I told you, you need to label the samples that's belonging to each class. Here I didn't do that. I just took the original X space and I did a scaled principal components. When I did that, I am essentially able to get better resolution between the clusters. Okay. So, that is one very nice property, theoretical property of the scaled PCA, which we use quite frequently in pre-processing of the data to be able to generate self aggregation and then use it onward for other applications. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Why am I telling you this just because it is yet another scaling technique associated with PCA? No, this actually motivates correspondence analysis. Okay. Now, look at this. What did I do here? I essentially pre-multiplied S with d to the minus half. I post multiplied S with d to the minus half, and then did the principal components of that inner term. Okay. Is there something else I could do? Okay. Turns out that correspondence analysis is based on this very important factorization, and so here is, without presenting you the theory, I will just tell you what correspondence analysis does as an analogy to what we just saw. Okay. So, what correspondence analysis does is it develops simple indices. Okay. So, simple to characterize row column association. Remember the desirable features of a pattern classifier. We said it should explain relationship between rows, explain relationship or samples, relationship between columns or relationship between variables, and the joint association between them. Okay. Turns out that correspondence analysis is able to represent the row column associations. So, unlike PCA, what does PCA decompose? PCA looks at, for example, a large balloon, maybe the ones that kids play with, the long balloon. If you want to represent that in an appropriate space, you say this is one direction, this is the other direction, deflate it, and you essentially get a deflated balloon, right? So, what PCA does is it is able to explain those directions. Okay. Here, instead of explaining the variance, correspondence analysis tries to represent what is called as a measure of independence between the row and columns, which is chi-square, which is a chi-square value. Okay. So, what correspondence analysis does is it says basically estimate the expected value of the entry of the matrix X and estimate the deviation of these values from the observed values. So, here is what I will quickly show you. This original X m cross n matrix. Okay. What I do is I pick up one Xij and I say that an estimate of that Xij, if the rows and columns are statistically independent, is given by row I times column j divided by the grand sum. Sounds like black magic, but there is a theory associated with this. We won't go into that theory, but if I look at the row, sum of the ith row, let us call that sum as row I. Look at the jth column, sum of that as call it as column j, call j, and I take the grand sum of all of these elements, that is g. If I look at this, CA says that that is a representative value of or estimate of Xij under the assumption that the rows and columns are statistically independent. Okay. Now, what I do is, this is the estimated value, this is the measured value, I look at the deviation of that, some kind of a scale deviation of that, and call that as a chi, a value t, which can be shown mathematically to be a chi-square distribution. Just like in PCA, you had a variance, here you are talking of a t, which is the chi-square distribution. Okay. Now, what I do is I decompose this t. When I do this chi-square decomposition, I can show that it is essentially the singular value decomposition of a matrix C whose elements are xij minus eij divided by square root of eij. Okay. So, if I construct a matrix C whose elements are xij, the actual measurement, eij, the estimate of that measurement, divided by square root of eij, okay, that if I subject to singular value decomposition, I get L mu m transpose. These are the singular value decomposition matrices associated with that, and now I can look at L mu and m transpose and derive certain very nice interpretations from those. Okay. Now, does this ring a bell? Okay, not yet. Let's look at an alternate interpretation of the same correspondence analysis. What we are now doing is, we are taking this matrix X, we are dividing it by the grand sum, each element is divided by the grand sum. I do an RC transpose. Remember what is R and what is C? R is the row sum and C is, so it's a vector of row sums, C is the vector of column sums. When I do an RC transpose, it gives me a matrix. I deflate the X by G with that matrix and I subject it to a singular value decomposition. Okay. Actually, it's called as a generalized SVD with these constraints: A transpose D minus D inverse A is equal to I and B transpose D inverse B is equal to I. With these as constraints, if I do a generalized SVD of this, I essentially also get the same factors of correspondence analysis. Okay. So, this is an alternate way of doing the same thing. If you look at this matrix now, it is D to the R minus half 1 by G X minus RC transpose D to the C minus half. Does this ring a bell? Go to scale principal components analysis. What we did was D to the minus half S D to the minus half and did a PCA of that. Here what we are doing is some appropriately scaled matrix dr to the minus half dc to the minus half. You see, the analogy is there. Okay, one need to get into the, I can show you the theoretical aspects of this, but we don't have the time for that. But there is a relationship now. What do we know about the earlier transformation? The earlier transformation gave us discrimination between columns. What does this help me to do? It helps me to identify association between rows, association between columns and the joint association between them. Okay, that is what I will quickly show you here. So, I will skip this in the interest of time. I will show you the relative comparison. So, you know, again coming back to our graphical way of viewing the matrix factorization, similar row points or similar column points clustered together just as what you saw in PCA. In PCA, when I look at a scores plot is essentially, these are the scores. When I plot T1 versus T2, if I have similar samples, they cluster together. Okay. If I look at the loadings plot, which is the plot of P1 versus P2, I get similar variables clustering together. Here what it helps me to do is similar row and similar row points and column points clustered together as in PCA. The proximity of a row and column point indicates that the row has a particularly important weight in the column space. So, you know, if I have a row marker that is close to a column marker, it tells me the relative importance between them. The origin is the average profile point and distances from the origin reflect the intensity, and typically the angle between them indicates either a positive association, a negative association or a neutral association. Okay. So, all of this can be achieved when you do an SVD of an appropriate scaled matrix. What is that scaled matrix? X minus RC transpose, sorry, X by G minus RC transpose, pre and post scaled by dr minus half and dc minus half. If I now apply an SVD on this, it achieves to me all of those desirable aspects of the pattern classifier. And I will just show you some quick relative examples here. This is a standard example that is posted up in the web available, Fisher's Irish data, 3 classes with each class containing 4 measurements of 50 observations. When we just plot them, you can see that there are 4 different measurements, 3 classes, total of 150 measurements. Okay. I want to be able to now try a principal components analysis of this, because what it helps me to do? It helps me to look at aspects of collinearity and resolution. I then want to apply Fisher's discriminant analysis on the same data. What does Fisher discriminant analysis do? It takes prior information about the classes and generates directions that are discriminatory in nature. I then want to go ahead and not use the prior information, but just use correspondence analysis, and then see whether it gives me a better resolution, okay, without using prior knowledge. Okay. Now here is a comparison of the three. So PCA gives me some amount of discrimination. So the original space is this. Okay. This is what PCA gives me. It says this class is separate, but then there is an overlap between this. What does FDA do? It gives me better resolution than a space that has better resolution than PCA. But look at what CA does. CA, without using any prior information amongst the classes about the classes, it's also able to give slightly better. We have some indices which I have not put here, slightly better than FDA, but it doesn't use prior information. Okay, so you are able to achieve slightly better or near performance as FDA, but without having to label the classes. Okay, I'll show you a second example. So what I have done is I have constructed some random samples here. I have said I have three variables and I have a fourth variable that is non-linearly related to the three random variables, two additional variables that are non-linearly related to them. And what I do is I introduce a step-like fault in one of those variables to give two clusters, and then I try to look at what PCA does. PCA shows me an overlap, but look at what correspondence analysis does. It clearly gives me a resolution between the classes. Okay, hypothetically constructed examples. Look at this very powerful example. Okay, this is the data, two classes in the original space. What can you see? You can see an overlap. You can also see that within each class also there is a sufficient amount of variance. Okay, when I apply correspondence analysis, here is what happens. In the new space, the two classes are completely resolved. Not only that, there is also a self-aggregation. Okay. Dynamic dependencies, I talked to you about the dynamic dependencies. I have four variables, two are related to each other in a dynamic way. I can derive certain interpretations from the dynamics point of view, which will help me to do the row and. So I can say now that x1, x3 and x4, because they are fall on the same line, they are in some way linearly correlated. You can see that the fourth one is here and all the points correspond around that. So the rows and columns are related in a dynamic way. I can do that kind of an interpretation from this plot. Okay. Yeah, I think I'll now look at one example, an industry example. Okay, this is what's called as a Tennessee-Eastman process. This is a process that Tennessee Eastman is a company in the US. They make a lot of chemicals, typically polymers, photochemicals, and all of that, specialty chemicals. Here is one flow sheet. Unfortunately, again, it's clearer in the notes that you will have, but it's not clearer here. What you see here is basically a number of operations that happen in this chemical reactor. There is a distillation column. There are a number of processing that happens in this plant. Okay. Now, what you want to be able to do is, in an operating plant, the first thing that you want to do is operate safely. Just like every millionth time an aircraft takes off, it must land safely. Okay. You want to make sure that the plants operate safely. So you want to be able to continuously monitor the plant operation and make sure that it belongs to a class. If we now start talking about classes, it belongs to a class which has a notion of normality with it. Okay. Not only that, if an aberrant operation happens, you want to be able to say that here is another class and this is an aberrant class. Okay. You don't want to stop just at that. If it's an aberrant class, you want to know why that aberration happened, right? Because when you want to initiate any remedial action, you want to be able to detect what's the source of the fault, right? So not only do you want to monitor it to be normal, if there is a fault, you want to be able to look at what's the variable that's causing the nuisance, correct it so that operation comes back to the normal operation, right? In many ways, or in every way, This problem is nothing but a principal components analysis in the X space that you get from the measurements in different variables, different samples, right. So, I can collect data from the plant, generate an X matrix, look at regions of normal operation and try to find out the dominant directions. Next time I do have an aberrant operation, when I project the data onto this space, I am able to then say that this is an abnormal operation. So, an early detection of an aberrant operation and an appropriate correction so that my plants run efficiently. So, that is the real background of this Tennessee-Eastman problem. What I will do is I will just show you the relative results that I get from principal components analysis and from the correspondence analysis. Okay. What I show you here, and maybe I have not given you the appropriate background to this, is this says variance explained versus the direction, the principal component number. What that means here, going back to our equation here, T1 is x times P1, it explains, let us say, 60% of the variance. T2 is x times P2, it explains the remaining, because remember it is orthogonal. So, it explains, let us say, the remaining 25% of the variance. T3 is x times P3, let us say that explains another 10% of the variance, new information, right. So, 65, 25, 10, so becomes 90, maybe we are going to 100. What you really want to do is say that when I represent this, the first explains so much information, the residual space is this, the second explains this, third is this, the residual space is this, fourth is this, and so on. So, what each additional component, how much of the information it explains. Okay. Remember now that PCA is a linear combination. Remember this? It is a linear combination, right? If I have a parabola, how well can I fit a parabola with a line? I can fit it only to a limited extent. I still have a large amount of unexplained variation in the parabola, right. So, if you look at this, the first principal component explains that much, second explains that much, third, fourth, and so on. What you see is there is a large amount of variance that is unexplained in the industrial data. Why? Because I am using linear principal components. Okay. You understand, everybody is comfortable with this? Now what we want to do is we want to see what, so if I analyze this table, what it is really trying to tell me is that the first principal component explains 12%, the second explains 7, but cumulatively they explain 20%. The first 3, the third one explains additional 5, but cumulatively explains 25, and so on. If you see all the way up to down, the first 15 combinations, the actual space is 52 variables, the first 15 combinations, and you see that it starts kind of tapering off. Beyond that, if I add any other linear combination, it is not going to add a further explanatory ability. Okay. Now, this is a problem because of the linear combination. Okay. Now, if I look at what correspondence analysis does, it is very dramatic. What correspondence analysis is able to do is, in the same number of linear combinations, you see it is able to explain. In fact, actually you should see it stops at beyond 10 or 11, it is not able to add anything. So, in 11 out of the original space is 52 variables, in 11 variables, 11 linear combinations, 11, I won't use the word linear combinations, 11 combinations of the original space, it is able to explain almost all of the variation. What is this variation? This variation is not variance, but row column associations. Okay. And if I have this kind of a explanation, it gives me much more confidence that now I have represented my 52 dimension space in 11 dimension space relatively to a much higher level of accuracy, and given this, now I have more confidence in the decision that I make when I say that a plant is operating normally or a plant is not operating normally. Okay. So, that is the benefit of the correspondence analysis. We did some validations in the lab. Professor Sachin has a very good lab setup in the automation lab. We did some real time experiments as well. several interpretations where in a controlled manner we were able to introduce sensor biases, we were able to introduce actuator biases, and then we try to interpret the same data using correspondence analysis, and we are able to derive interpretations as expected. Okay, so now I talked a lot about PCA, Fisher's discriminant analysis, correspondence analysis from a classification point of view, from a class representation point of view. But I am sure in the earlier lectures you have also been exposed to regression problems, right? How do you build a very stable relationship between, let's say you want to do a regression between a variable y and several variables x. How do you make that in a stable manner in the presence of noise, in the presence of correlations and collinearity and so on, right? Must have done that? Yes, part of you have been exposed to that. Yeah. So there is, like PCA, there is an associated approach called projection to latent structures, or PLS. Okay. The reason I did not spend too much time on this was because PCA and PLS are very closely related. Okay. In PCA, what you do is you look at a matrix X, okay, which essentially consists of x1 up to xn. Okay, so it has a number of samples, and what you do is you essentially try to explain the variance or dependency between some xj and some xk. You try to see if there is a correlation between the two. Okay, what happens if I just take this outside of the matrix? So if I do this, if I just say that I have my x new, which is x1 up to xn, but xj is not part of it, so I move this xj into another matrix y, another vector y, which is just xj. Now this is a regression problem where I am trying to relate y to x. In PCA by itself, I am trying to establish the relationship between all of the variables. Here I am going to estimate the relationship between y and x, which is in a way similar to PCA. In fact, it has been theoretically shown that while you look at x transpose x, okay, so you start with x and then you subject it, you do an x transpose x, and then you do a singular valued decomposition. You can write x as Tp transpose plus E, where T and P can be estimated either from the covariance matrix or from a singular value decomposition. It turns out that for this algorithm called PLS, you are essentially looking at y transpose x, which is the variable that you want to regress, right? Y and the predictor variables and the predicted variable. Y transpose is, if I take that and do a PCA of this, if I do a PCA of this, y transpose x, this is nothing but the PLS algorithm. It can be mathematically shown that this is PLS, or projection to latent structures. Okay, so it's in a way the covariance is shaped by y. We are essentially trying to explain the variance in x as explanatory of y. That's how you would interpret y transpose x. Okay, so I won't delve into the maths of this, but what I'll do is I'll just show you some examples where we have used this PCA for trying to build stable regression models. Now this example is the work that we carried out at Mitsubishi Chemical Corporation, Japan. It's actually more than 15-20 years old, so now I don't think there's a problem to share it. You can put it in the notes, there is no problem, right? So this is a problem associated with distillation. How many of you remember distillation from your high school days, right? What happens in a distillation? You start with a binary mixture, miscible mixture of a heavy and a light component. You boil it, the lighter components come up and the heavier component stays down, and eventually through distillation plates, you distill and get the lighter product at the top and the heavier product at the bottom. Okay. Now Mitsubishi had a high purity distillation column. What does high purity mean? I mean, it's essentially, high purity means 99.9999 4 nines or 3 nines, that's the kind of purity that they are looking at. Now, many times it's not the nines, but the remainder 0.0001, which is also equally important. For example, if it happens to be, let's say, potassium cyanide with 0.001, you don't want that, right? But typically it's characterized in terms of the number of nines, okay? Now, in this high purity distillation column, just for you to understand, that higher the purity, I can go from 99.5 to 99.9 with relatively lesser effort. But if I want to go from 99.9 to 99.99, or it requires much more effort. 99.99 to 99.999, the 3 nines, because it scales non-linearly. Okay, parallel example from day-to-day life is, if you are doing a 100-meter dash, the first time you do it, you might take 25 seconds. It's very easy to improve your timing to, let's say, 20 seconds. 18 seconds, slightly tougher. 17 seconds, much more practice. If you want to beat PT Usha, probably asymptotically you'll reach there, right? That's the non-linearity we are talking about here. Okay, what that means from an engineering point of view, the more the effort I need in a distillation column, higher is its energy cost. Energy costs are phenomenal, and they came to us with this problem that in a high purity distillation column, we are purifying more than necessary. Energy is much higher. The spec that the government has set is 100 parts per million of the impurity, but the specs are so stringent that even if we violate it once, our product is out. So we don't want to violate it even once. So we operate at 50. And if you operate at 50 instead of operating at 100, I am consuming much more energy than what I should. Okay? So that is the kind of problem. Unfortunately, in all of this, there is no sensor to sense the impurity level. Okay? You want to control impurities, but there is no thermometer that you can stick in there and say this is the impurity level. So what would you do? You would estimate it. You take lab samples, send it to the lab, you get the analysis, do this for about 100 or 1000 samples, and try to establish a relationship between what you can measure, which is part of this X block, and what you cannot measure, which is a part of the Y block, and then use that as a predictor. Okay, so that's the example, estimation of distillation tower top composition using projection to latent structures. Now, why is this problem particularly important is because, again, this is a very good example of the use of SVD to generate a very stable regression algorithm. Okay, here is what I will show you. I just told you all about this. You need to inference, which means you need to get an estimate. You need a reliable regression model. This is very important. See, when you collect data and you try to build a regression model, make sure that the data itself does not contain dependencies or collinearities. If you do that, then if you just do ordinary least squares, you're going to have deep trouble. You're into deep trouble, right? So when you have strongly collinear variables, you want a reliable regression model. Not only that, it's important to know the right variables that need to go into this X block that will help you to reliably predict the Y block. You can't put a lot of variables. If you do that, then you might get biased estimates. You can't put too few variables, because if there is a variable that you have missed out, then you will not be able to explain the Y. So you want to put the right number of variables. Okay? So systematic variable selection to obtain the minimal model. Okay? So here is that distillation column. So if you remember your chemistry, the feed goes in from here. It gets these are the sections where distillation happens. You get the top product from here, you get the bottom product from here. This will be purer in the light component, this will be purer in the heavier component. Okay, and you want to make sure that in this there is no impurity, because that's what gets into your car. If I have muck getting along with my petrol into the car will not start, or it will burn and emit noxious fumes. I don't want that, right? So I want a stringent quality check on this one. Unfortunately, it's measured once every 90 minutes. If it's measured once every 90 minutes and if there is a variation, there is no way I would know. I need to be able to reliably predict it and I want to reliably control it. How do I control it? The control is typically through what's called as a reflux, which is manipulable every half a minute or so. Okay. So there were certain issues associated with that. A lot of pressure changes, lot of delays in the online analyzer. So this analyzer, sorry, it's not going back. This analyzer gave me measurements once every 90 minutes, and that too after a delay. Now that was a problem. So a number of collinear variables for that, temperatures and pressures. Now if you do ordinary least squares, you have a problem. You can't build a stable regressor, so you need to essentially look at how do you deal with collinear variables. There is more noise than signal sometimes. Okay, especially when you are measuring vapors, the vapor flow and the vapor composition. If you are trying to measure the composition of the vapor, there is a lot of noise associated with that. You need to be able to see how well you can deal with that noise and the like. Incidentally, I didn't mention this to you. Okay, remember I said X is TP transpose plus E. If you remember that, what is that E? That E is something that you don't want to model. You don't want to model. Noise is an infinite dimension process. You cannot and you don't want to model it. If you try to model the noise, then your predictability becomes very poor because noise cannot be predicted. It's a random noise. You don't want to predict noise. So you want to be able to separate out the noise, and in fact PCA has also been used as a good denoising algorithm before you actually get into regression. Okay, it tries to separate out the noise in that E, and then the remaining part of X is what you can use further for regression. Okay, so coming back here, the noise is something that one has to look at. Here are the X and Y variables. Remember, what is the X? X is the predictor, the variables that are measured more frequently, and you want to use them to predict what you cannot measure, which is the Y. Okay, so what you see on this is a number of X variables. For example, the top section temperature. These are very easy. You just have to stick in a thermocouple. You have a flow sensor, then you have a pressure sensor, and all of that. So all of these are, sensors are available. You get measurements, but they come with noise. Again, what you want to be able to predict? This blue thing over here, which is the top composition, for which there is no sensor. No sensor meaning there is a sensor that measures it once every 90 minutes. It's pointless because if there is a variation in the top composition, you may or may not be able to detect it if you don't sample it rapidly. Okay, so you want to be able to estimate it more rapidly. Okay, so there were a number of aspects to this. For example, there is a dead time of the analyzer. I said send it out, get it back from the labs. We tried a PLS model first that gave maximum correlation of the gas chromatograph, which was the sensor output, and then we did some. This is way back, so I know it's very easy. Now you can share this data. Nothing confidential about it. The gas chromatograph related aspects, we split the data into two parts: estimation data, validation data, and then the estimation of the noise. Remember X is equal to TP transpose plus E. You can estimate the noise in each of those variables and try to filter out the noise. You can see that, for example, some of the flow measurements here are more noisier than, for example, the temperature measurements and the like. Right? So those kind of this is very well known from even practice, that when you stick in a temperature sensor, there is usually a filtering that happens at because of a thermo well, and that gives you relatively less noisier measurements than pressure. Pressure is rapid transients; it gives you a lot of noise associated with it. Likewise, flow and so on. Okay. So without going into too much of details of this, appropriate scalings need to be applied to reduce the impact of noise in your estimates and so on. You looked at each the importance of variable. Now this is something that also principal components analysis, the loadings plot can give you. What the loadings plot can give you is how important is a variable in explaining the variance or in explaining a relationship. Okay, so you can actually rank the variables in the X block depending on decreasing order of their ability to explain the variance. So we were able to do that, and using different kinds of scaling, we will establish each variable's contribution to the model. Now, how do you select amongst the 26 variables to my recollection? We were able to screen it down to about 12. I think somewhere I have mentioned this here. Yeah, so this is the loading vector. Let me just tell you first the number. We first came from 26 to 10. 26 variables were there in the original space. Through first principles knowledge, through knowledge of the physics, we were able to reduce it to 10, but even this number was fairly large. Okay. We were then able to reduce it to 4 using the projection to latent structures, and then this was the original least squares model, which was not a very stable regressor. But what PLS helped us to do was identify that pressure is an important variable that contributes to the top estimate. So we included pressure over here, and once we did that, here is the original model prediction. You see that in some places the model predictions are pretty bad. For example, here and here, whereas it improves when you use a PLS. Okay, and then we essentially implemented control actions. Here was the impurity before control. You see, sorry, I used the word, I said 100 ppm, it's actually 1000 ppm. 1000 ppm is what they should maintain, but you see, they were going away from it. So it's like an unknown beast. Okay, if the beast behavior is unknown, you want to stay as far away from that as possible. So 1000 ppm was the limit. The operators were really scared to even go close to it. They were operating substantially away from it, okay, because they did not know what was the actual impurity available. There was no sensor. Now when this estimator was introduced, turned out that now you are able to go much closer to that 1000 ppm and thereby save a huge amount of energy, right. So that's the result of this. A reliable model was obtained. Systematic variable selection using singular value decomposition for PLS, and then the product quality was improved, a huge saving of energy since then. Okay, so this was the second example that I wanted to tell you in terms of the application of SVD. We have also applied it to a number of other domains. For example, in pharma. In pharma manufacturing, pharma eventually produces what's called as an API, an active pharmaceutical ingredient, which gets into your formulations and which we take, right. Now, if there is a fault or if there is a contaminant, it's a big no, and so drug rejects, recalls are fairly common. Okay, so a very tight monitoring of the operation of a pharma reactor is crucial, and so we were able to develop that kind, again using principal components analysis. But principal components analysis, we look right now in 2 dimensions, right, variable space and time space. Okay, when you are doing pharma application, there are batch reactors, you need to look at the batch space as well as the 3rd dimension. So it is called multi-way principal components analysis. So MPCA, that also is now very active in research. They are able to actually develop that algorithm and give it to one of these companies. They patented it, and they are currently using this now to adhere to what's the US FDA's regulatory structure around most pharma manufacturing. This actually fits in quite nicely to be able to monitor pharma applications and be able to provide real-time qualification of the batch and real-time release of the batch, which are considered important in pharma manufacturing. So a lot of exciting challenges, a lot of exciting problems, SVD, all of this based on singular value, the linear algebra and statistics. If you have put in this, then you can actually do a lot more things. Thank you very much for your attention.